understand that some of the terms used in this video can be offensive for some viewers, especially the Aboriginal people. These days, people refrain from using these titles and identify Aboriginal people by their rightful name. However, back then, the laws referred to Aboriginal people as Aborigines and half-caste. Therefore, for historical context, I shall refer to the names of the laws as they were written.
Okay. This is no way racist. He is just referring to the way of the law.
During the 1900s, the Aboriginal populations of Australia were subject to some of the most stringent laws.
Why are they low? Black. This shit makes me look white, but they're a little black.
Governing a native population. The goal of these laws was regulating the lives of countless people and integrating them into a white society, often with brutal methods. In today's video, we will be covering the use of a particular settlement in the pursuit of these goals.
Australia was a prison colony. I don't know why they're going against the Aboriginal people. Y'all niggas were prisoners.
It is important to first
That's why Australia's hell on earth. Fuck y'all niggas. Fuck these Australian niggas.
With ancestral birth ties to Australia, and those who were seen as black by the white inhabitants of Australia. Official figures released in 1921, which were later greeted with a level of skepticism, estimated the Aboriginal...
Pause. I gotta get my do-rag for this shit, bro. What? I ain't gonna lie. There's a point of history where I just think, like, it just turned around and white people just started hating other white people for no fucking reason. Because why the fuck are you guys having beef with Irish people? They're white. Nigga, they hated people from Scotland. Like, white people just hate Irish, Jews. They probably they hate gypsies. Why do you hate other white people? Like, you guys just hate everything. Like, you guys will never be happy in this world. It's like, damn. They hate the Irish, they hate the Jews, they hate the gypsies. They're white people too, my nigga. As long as you don't match their, like, views at that period of time, you are being persecuted like hell. Like, let me tell you shit. Hold on. Niggas consider them white. Niggas consider them black. Aight.
Population being as low as 75,000. Many people in Australia believed the Aboriginals to be a dying race, and as one, incompatible with the white way of life. This is a sentiment that was present in the press, with the Perth Sunday Times writing, "Central Australia's half-caste problem must be tackled boldly and immediately. The greatest danger, experts agree, is that three races will develop in Australia: white, black, and the pathetic, sinister third race, which is neither." End quote. This official concern can perhaps be best noted in the long name of a piece of 1897 legislation in Queensland. A bill to make provision...
What? Nah, what?
This half-caste problem must be tackled boldly and immediately. The greatest danger, experts agree, is that three races will develop in Australia: white, black, and the pathetic, sinister third race, which is neither. End quote. This official concern can perhaps be best noted in the long name of a piece of 1897
they consider them black or neither.
A bill to make provision for the better protection.
What the fuck is a neither?
Aboriginal and
like, what the fuck is a neither? Like they're not black or white. Like, y'all hated the blacks. So what the fuck is a neither?
And half-caste inhabitants of the colony. After several pieces of legislation were proposed, the 1905 Aborigines Act was eventually enacted to make provision for the better protection and care for the Aboriginal inhabitants of Western Australia. This
It is hereby notified that all the lands compromised in the area described below have now been proclaimed to be an area in which it shall be unlawful for Aborigines or half-castes, no offense, not in lawful employment to be or remain. The United States 2.0.
This legislation authorized a position known as the Chief Protector of Aborigines. This granted that appointed individual the position of legal guardian of every Aboriginal child up to the age of 16, and stripping this responsibility from a child's biological parents. Power over these children was extended to the authorities, providing specific permission to send and detain the children in institutions and in service with the education of Aboriginal and mixed-race children being enshrined. These children would also be subject to detainment in institutions, industrial schools, or orphanages. You may have noted that the word authorized was used there, not created. This is because from 1898, the role of the Chief Protector had been filled by a man named Henry Charles Prinsep. A man whose background included, but was not limited to, estate management, horse rearing, and the civil service. Prinsep held the role without legal authority until the 1905 legislation limited to estate management, horse rearing, and the civil service.
He was going to treat these niggas like
Prinsep
animals,
held the
bro.
role without legal authority until
He was
the
gonna treat them like
1905
animals.
legislation formally established it. It was argued at the time that it was the state's responsibility to protect mixed-race children. With enough supervision and training from the state's institutions, could lead a future of...
You know, I knew white people were out of their goddamn Caucasian mind when they went to South Africa and had apartheid. How are you trying to control a black country? How are you the minority of a country and you're trying to control that? Like, what if black people in the United States did that shit, we would have been out of our black minds. How the minority was controlling the, like, that shit, like,
useful workers.
These white people are out their Caucasian mind back in the day.
By a previous piece of legislation with the same name, the Aborigines Act of 1897. Lacking the parental consent or legal powers to enact, this frustrated Prinsep, reportedly making him feel powerless to address the ill treatment faced by the members of the Aboriginal tribes. With the 1905 Act, Prinsep was finally given the authority he so craved. He alone had control over the upbringing of Aboriginal children, and he would decide what would be in their
raise them white,
best
bro.
interests. Large numbers of children, predominantly those that were mixed race, were removed from their Aboriginal mothers, with a particular focus by the authorities on separating those that had lighter skin. A 1997 report into the history of these children, titled Bringing Them Home, observed that the exact number of these children is unknown, but it was at least 100,000, and they were subject to forced removal from their parents in often brutal fashion, sometimes as soon as the child was born.
That is fucked up.
Where does it ew?
Yo, thank you for the follow.
Ew.
That is fucked up. As soon as they were born, you know how many kids that don't know their parents from that?
As can be expected, many families took to hiding their children whenever the police arrived, not wanting their children to be taken to any of the institutions. Parents that attempted to prevent their children
never be able to hide your kids
were held
from
in
the
police
police
bays as a consequence. A common approach taken by the parents of these children was to blacken their skin. This was done by crushing charcoal and mixing it with animal fat and smothering their child in the substance. Many well aware of the state's preference for lighter-skinned children. Many children were nonetheless caught, separated from their parents, and placed into homes, missions, or settlements.
The more I watch this, the more I notice that racism is everywhere. Damn, I really thought the Australians were good, but damn, these niggas, damn,
In line with
okay.
the aims of the 1905 legislation.
They were
One
trying to
such
get that
settlement where the
white.
children could end up
They were
was
trying
the
to make it
Moore River
predominantly
Native Settlement.
white.
The settlement was built in 1918 near the headwaters of its river's namesake and around 80 miles north of Perth, Western Australia. The area had initially been intended to act as a farming camp, but was repurposed to house the Aboriginal people after it was deemed unfit to grow crops. It soon became a twisted amalgam of a prison welfare hostel and a dumping ground for the elderly and destitute members of the Aboriginal community, notably young mothers. The settlement was established by Chief Protector A. O. Neville, who took the position in
I'm not gonna say
1915.
nothing.
Neville firmly believed in the notion of breeding out the colour from the Aboriginal population.
This nigga said breeding out the color.
And to
Don't
raise
be
the
mad.
children as if they were white, with the encouragement to marry people with lighter skin tones. The aim, over successive generations, was to remove the Aboriginals from Australia. The aforementioned Bringing Them Home report commented that many of the people
Breeding
within
out
the
the
settlement
white.
were therefore
Bring out the
rehabilitation,
color.
with a perception that the police would effectively round up Aboriginal people. This would include those.
So they were collecting light-skinned babies and mixed babies to marry more white. Like, don't they know they won't be able to breed out the color as long as there's dark-skinned people, dark-skinned Aboriginal peoples. They won't be able to breed out the color, but we'll never know what was going to happen because they had to
alcohol-related
end that
offences,
shit early.
who would simply be sent to the settlement as opposed to face the same legal punishments of their white counterparts. Other reports have referred to much of the settlement being treated simply as a dumping ground for Aboriginal people who were poor, old, and sick with nowhere else to live. The settlement has retrospectively been described by some as a convenient hiding space for a perceived problem that could not be properly solved. The children housed at the Moore River settlement were subject to education and work training so that they could be able to function in a white society. As workers, they were trained to live as domestic servants off a factory, farm, and station work. Girls were trained in domestic labor and partook in sewing classes. Whilst education was apparently treated as a high priority, school time for the inhabitants of the settlers was only about 3 hours per day. The buildings in which the children were expected to sleep were dilapidated and often.
Ain't no way them niggas were sleeping in shacks like those. I know, like, what? Their fixation with making the world white is just, it's mind blowing because they even hate other white people. Like, why the fuck are you beefing with Jews because they don't believe in the same religion that you believe in? And why are you beefing with the Irish because they got different color hair? Like, their fixation is just, it's mind blowing and it's fucking stupid.
Many lived in the most basic of tents or shacks, exposing them to the cold winters. In some instances, the shelters were little more than tree branches with a piece of canvas draped over the top.
Ain't no way.
If there was a sense that there were insufficient resources, the influx of more people only exacerbated the situation. During the Great Depression of the 1920s and the Second World War almost 2 decades later, the lack of funding was made all the more apparent as resources all but evaporated.
These niggas were living in branch houses.
Dorms were built for young girls, young men, and married couples. It was not enough to deal with the poor conditions. With the amount of people living at the settlements, all of these dorms quickly became overcrowded.
And you know what's crazy? How much you want to bet that they blame the Aboriginal people for the lack of funding? How much you want to bet like the white population or the middle class population in that area will blame the Aboriginal people for the lack of funding, and and they're going to avoid that area no matter what.
Day-to-day
It's
life
your
at the
fault. It's the
settlement was
government
heavily
fault. So like,
regimented. There was strict segregation by age and sex, with children separated from their parents and their siblings.
oh,
Leaving their premises was strictly forbidden without express written permission to do so. Many of the male inhabitants were trained as trackers for the anticipated escape for those who wished to return to their original communities. Despite this segregation on these characteristics, it should be noted that no such segregation or separation was made in relation to language or culture. Due to poor conditions and forcible placement, many of the settlement's inhabitants attempted to leave the settlement. In 1923, a 3.5 square meter shed was built to punish those who attempted to escape. Many of those who tried to escape were children looking for their parents. The shed was named the Boob,
Right.
which, although now sounding comical, it was anything but. Little about the specific treatment of the individuals forced to remain in this shed is known, such as the length of time they were expected.
like the people in power nowadays are not as extreme with their beliefs from the people in power. Let's say in this time period, I think this was like the 1900s, 1940s. So like, breed the color out. Like that was the main statement for this. Breed the color out of them. They wanted to like they wanted to make it they wanted to make it a white country, which is impossible because at the end of the day there will still be black people coming in from Africa, from the United States, from other countries that has a mix that has a mix of color. So bringing the black out of them would have just fucked up the like bringing the black out of them wouldn't make sense, right? But if you look at South Africa, when the white people got in power, they started apartheid, and that fucked like. And South Africa is a majority white country, so that fucked up the whole not white, a majority black country. So that fucked up everything that happened. Once white people get in power, they become crazy. I don't know, like I don't know why. How do you control a majority black country and you're the minority? I don't know how the fuck that happened. I don't know how they let that happen, but it happened.
To remain
And
in there, or even how the food or water was
white people
provided.
just can't be in
Time
power no
spent in
more.
the boob would
People
have been
shouldn't be in
incredibly
power,
hot.
actually. Fuck,
Inside
not
a
even
small
white people.
metal shack that
People
would hold
shouldn't
the
be in
heat,
power.
acting more like an oven. The boob was also used in conjunction with other abuses at the settlement.
It
Many
will
of the
hold their
inhabitants
heat.
were often severely beaten and subject to SA. It was reported that Superintendent A.J. Neal would beat, whip, and commit SA before imprisoning
the
those
f-
within the blistering hot shed, and many
he
of
was
those
gay.
being children within his care.
Yeah, he was
Simply
gay.
leaving the settlement having been trained to integrate into white society was not necessarily the end of one's stay at Moore River Native Settlement. Many of those that
SA.
entered white society
And
found
he did to
themselves
boys too.
abused. This only created a vicious cycle, leading to their return to the settlement, often where women would return pregnant. The Moore River settlement would report some 374 deaths, with 203 of them being children, and 149 of these children died under the age of 5, with a large number of these being less than a year old. Many of these deaths were from conditions that we know
They
to be
were
treatable,
newborns.
such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and malnourishment. One particularly grim example was that of a child that was only 8 days old when she died of bronchitis.
They don't give a fuck. Like they just don't care. As long as you're not Caucasian or you don't conform to their beliefs, they will not care about you. That's crazy. Like, they were children's. Like, the baby was 8 days old and she had bronchitis.
It was not until 1964 that the 1905 Aborigines Act was repealed, and in 1974, the Moore River Native Settlement was eventually closed.
1964.
Kevin
And it
Rudd,
wasn't
the former Prime
closed.
Minister of Australia, apologised on behalf of the Australian government in 2008 to the Indigenous Australian population. He acknowledged the mistreatment of the stolen generations, which he described as a blemished chapter in the nation's history, referring to the separation of families and communities. The apology also came with a vow to close the gap in relations to life expectancy, educational achievement, and economic opportunity. In the years since the stolen generations, different regions of Australia having
They know they messed up. Now they're trying to fix it. Like, it's a scar on history. Like, what? How can I put this? Like, no, like, okay, it's one thing doing it, it's another thing acknowledging that you did it and apologizing for it. Now they are trying to close the gap in education and life expectancy. Okay, that's good. But to the people who survived the camps, like, what would they get out in return? They survived the camp. They probably got SA'd. Some terrible shit happened. What would they get out? What would they get? They had PTSD. They have trauma. Mentally, they're probably not there. So, apologizing does not help the fact that some people are mentally
engaged
traumatized
in
in
legal
this
cases and
shit.
compensatory action. For example, Western Australia allocated the sum of $2.5 million in compensation over the course of 9 months.
They got reparations?
But more recently, a case was filed against the West Australian government by Aboriginal elders for what they claim to be stolen wages from labour in the 1930s and 1950s, under the impression that this was for the purpose of reintegration. The history of Australia's treatment of Aboriginal people is far longer than this single video could ever possibly hope to cover. And whilst this piece has touched on some of the background and eventual apologies for the stolen generation, it has nonetheless focused on a single settlement that occurred during a specific period of Australian history. There are plenty of stories of the brutal massacres and further discrimination against the Australian Aboriginals. The Moore River Native Settlement is far from the only settlement of its nature, and we will be covering more in the future. During my travels in Australia, I spent some time in various cities and went to some of the museums which highlighted the horrors of the stolen generations and the White Australia policy. If you ever happen to travel to Australia, I would recommend having a walk through the museums and seeing the stories of those affected by such cruel policies.
If the USA ever gave out reparations, they'll need to give out reparations to the Japanese, the Black, the Chinese, anybody from Hawaii who got the anybody I don't know how to say it. Anybody from the original Hawaiian tribes, the Native Americans, the Irish, shit, the Latinos and the Latinas, the Latinx community, shit, even more. Like, that would be trillions of dollars in reparations. Like, just because of that. Like, that's like 8 different races. That is trillions of dollars of reparation. The United States will never do that because of inflation. They know what they're doing.